today we are doing something a little bit different. Oh, that's what I'm supposed to answer. So, I'm going to move that too. Sorry guys, ruining everything. So today we're doing things a little bit different, and we've got a family Sunday today, so we're going to have our kids with us for the whole time. We're really excited about it, and I've got a whole bunch of questions for the kids while we're going. So kids, are you guys cool listening, and I can ask you some questions? I love that happened. Okay. We also have the Church Center app. If you want to tap your phone with a little card in front of you or scan it, you can download that and follow along with the notes. We'll have stuff up on the screen here today too. But today we're continuing our series going through the book of Romans. And Romans is really an incredible book. It's a letter written from Paul to the people in Rome. Now, Rome at the time when this was written in about 56 AD was a really weird city. Honestly, it was kind of like today in most metropolitan cities where it's all these different people that are mixed from all over the world. So in Rome at the time, we had people that were from a Jewish background, people who were Greek, people who were Syrians, who were Egyptians, and even some who had come up from sub-Saharan Africa. So all the way down in Africa, they came all the way up. And people really started to kind of mix together in a really weird way, okay? Think about it this way. Can you imagine a city back then of about 1 million people? Today, we're in a city of 2 million people, and we have stuff pretty well worked out, but can you just imagine the stink? Genuinely, just think about 1 million people all together back in the day where people didn't bathe the way they do. And there's people from all over the world doing all the different things, all the different types of food and everything all mixing. It was just absolute chaos, you know? So originally I'm from Los Angeles. Has anyone ever been to LA? We got a couple, actually more than I expected. Okay, cool. So LA is a super diverse city. There are over 140 people groups all in this one city, all mixed together. You got a hand up? You want to move? Is this better? Okay. Donate to our sounds. I'm just kidding. We'll figure it out. So LA is this super weird city where there's 140 different people groups all mixed up. And it's kind of you know how everyone knows what Chinatown is, right? But then there's Koreatown, and there's Little Vietnam, and then there's the Congolese group, and then there's the Senegalese group. There's all these different people from all over the world that are all mixed together. And LA is called a melting pot. You guys ever heard that? So yeah, melting pot is where you mix all these different people together, and they just turn into one big conglomerate of people. But honestly, I don't really love the moniker of melting pot. I don't think it's super accurate. I think a way more accurate thing is salad bowl. So a salad bowl is where you throw everything into a bowl, and everything remains what it is. Lettuce is still lettuce. Tomato is still tomato, but you kind of drizzle salad dressing in, and then the lines blur of what everything is. And the longer you let it sit, the more it just turns into a mush. That's exactly what it is. Everything remains what it is, but it just shifts a little bit, it changes a little bit. And essentially, that's what we're dealing with here in Rome. And in LA, what you get is really weird restaurants that come together. One time I went to an Asian fusion restaurant. You guys ever been to Asian fusion? So usually Asian fusion is great. But I went to an Asian fusion place in LA one time, and they had kimchi quesadillas. Yeah, so it's kimchi is it's a Korean thing, and it's fermented cabbage. And that was in a Mexican quesadilla. And I was that's not Asian fusion. That's just throwing stuff together. That's so weird. And you end up with religions that get thrown together. You know, there's a ton of Unitarian churches in bigger cities like that where people are essentially just mixing Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity. And you end up with something that is not any of them and is definitely not biblical. And then you have a whole bunch of different things where things come together and actually it's really fascinating. Within a couple generations, you can get whole new languages that are mixes of different people groups living in the same area and also speaking English, and there's all new slang. I was actually just talking to Maricel, if you guys know her. She comes here often, Heather's mom, And she was saying, like, when she goes back home, often people are like, where are you from? And she's like, I'm from here. I'm from the Philippines. I'm like, no, where are you from? You don't sound like you're from here at all. And she's lived here not long enough really to not sound like somebody from there. But it's interesting how we change when we get mixed in a big group. So kids, I've got a question for you, okay? All right, kids, listen up. I got a question. Have you guys ever mixed two really weird foods together? I don't believe you for a second, Jed. Jed, what have you mixed together that was weird? Anything? What do you think? Does any other kids have an answer? Peanut butter and bologna? That's real gross. Yeah, that wasn't me, I swear. All right, adults, what about you? Have you guys ever mixed anything super weird? Sugar and spinach? I think that just threw up on your shoulder. I'm with it. What? Garlic bread and jelly? Like a grape jelly?
He does that.
Getting kind of dangerous.
He's done it at my house.
What else? Any other weird ones?
Banana and cheese.
Banana and cheese? What? Cottage cheese and Doritos. That actually kind of sounds like it would work, and I don't know why. That's what Asian fusion works, you know? Like when you're like, I don't know how these two work, but this is great. It's like Gordita, like that's that. But yeah, like, so a lot of those things are kind of gross, but a lot of them you end up with something like that that's like kind of beautiful in a really disgusting way. And essentially that's what's happening at Rome here in Rome at this time. Like there are all these different thought processes coming together, all these different ideas, and they're all coming together. And there are three schools of philosophy that came out of this time in Rome. And people would get together at the forum here, like the background to this is the forum in Rome, and people would get together and like share all these ideas. And you had people that believed in Stoicism. So the Stoics were people who believed in rationality, virtue, duty, and acceptance of fate. So those people that were like, whatever happens, happens, and the only thing you can change is how you respond to it. And Stoicism is actually still the core of business training and military training in the Western world today. Like that's how we do like police training and like how you handle situations with Stoicism. And then you've got Epicureanism, where they believe that the goal of life is pleasure. These people thought like the whole goal in everything is to get rid of any discomfort and make it so that everything makes you happy. And that is super pervasive today. Like that is actually the goal of atheism in America. Is let's just find things that make us happy. Like people who actually fight for atheism as a culture. It's super common among college-educated people. Are actually now brought into college with the idea of finding a job that brings you the most happiness. I don't know if that's your guys' experience, but that's what most people are there for. Some people just want money, but that's always going to be a thing. And then you've got skepticism, and those are people who believe that you can know nothing for sure. Like everything has a question mark on it. So essentially that's people today who are like, oh, what is your truth? You know, that's a huge movement today about the idea of relative truth and not knowing if anything is ever actually true. So you've got this crazy mix of people. People that are like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you got this. People that are like, just get rid of the bad things in your life and be happy, man. And people who are kind of like, well, what is truth anyway? Nothing is known. It's all just a big question mark. And you throw all those people together in a blender. They're all talking there all at the same time, all trying to get people to listen to them, basically preaching these philosophical ideas. And it turns into this crazy salad bowl of people. Now, that's not really that hard to imagine because we live in that, right? Like literally all three of those things are super pervasive in our culture today. And every 4th November, that's all we talk about are those things and how we see the world through these philosophical lenses. So Paul is taking a little bit of time and he's actually speaking to those people. That's one thing that I really love about the book of Romans is that it's specifically to the people who are trying to hold in all those things. And there's actually some people that would say that they don't think that Paul wrote Romans because it sounds totally different than the other books. But really what's happening is Paul is speaking to his audience, and he's trying to take the argument and speak it in a way that the people that are there are going to listen to. So he's speaking very like psychological and all this, and pressing into these schools of philosophy. So in this context, you've got a couple different people here, okay? So you've got the Jews who, what's their background in? They're Jewish. Yep, they've got Judaism, like they've got the law. They're people who, for years, have been trying to establish this law and trying to live this law, and then all of a sudden they say yes to Jesus. So what do they try to do? They try to mix those two things, right? And you've got all these Jews who are like, yeah, but the law. Yes, Jesus completed the law, but the law. We still need to think about the law. How do we meld those two things? So he's talking to those people, and those people specifically land on a thing called legalism, where they are trying hard to keep living out the law, even though Jesus completed the law. And then you've got the other people, the Gentiles, who are living in this area, and they're taking all the rest of that stuff, all those other crazy ideas, and all the African mindset, and all the Asian mindset, and all these different people from all over the world are coming to this place in Rome and trying to mix those with Jesus. And they're mostly thinking, well, Jesus saved me, so I'm just like good, right? I can keep doing what I want to do because I'm saved. So we've got this this little kind of thing here showing what this sin looked like and how people kind of default one way or the other. Now, as we kind of go through this chart, we'll keep pulling this back up over the sermon today, but essentially you've got these like wrong ways of looking at sin, and then the right way in the middle is where we find Jesus. And ultimately it's where you see a healthy view of what the gospel should be. So again, the legalist side is the side, it's mostly the Jews who are just trying to follow the letter of the law, even though Jesus has saved them. And then on the other side, the licensed, you have mostly the Gentiles who are trying to mix all these other things and basically say, like, I don't have to be perfect because Jesus saved me, so it doesn't really matter if I keep sinning. Now, wherever you land on this line here, you're still saved if you know Jesus, right? If you've given your life to Jesus, if you have committed yourself to Him, if He is in your heart, if He's changing you, then it doesn't matter where you are on this line, you still know Jesus. But a lot of us lean sometimes towards the legalism of trying to be perfect, and a lot of us lean towards the license of like, it doesn't really matter what I do. And if you're anything like me, you're like 2/3 of the way to legalistic on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday you're like most of the way towards license, and then on Sunday you're in the middle as much as you can be because it's like the Lord's Day, and then you're like shifting back and forth all over that, right? So I think the question for us has to become, how do we get to the middle on this stuff? Like, how do we not get so wrapped up in legalism that we're just focusing completely on the law and completely on like doing everything the Bible says to do exactly as it says to do it and being perfect? At the same time, we don't want to be on the other side and not do anything the Bible says to do, because we should try to shoot to be like Jesus. We should try to act like Him and try to be better than we have been. So essentially this whole book, or at least a good chunk of this book of Romans, is Paul making the philosophical argument to the Romans of how do you land in the middle? How do you land on the fullness of knowing who God is and what He's done, but also desperately wanting to look like Him and wanting to do the right thing because of who He is? So that's kind of what we're shooting for here. And he takes the first 3 chapters and he starts this philosophical argument. How long have we been in this series? Do you guys know?
3 weeks.
I think this is week 4. Yeah. Maybe it's 5. Whatever it is. So between 4 and 5 weeks. So we're somewhere in there. Let me just say this. The first 4 chapters easily could have been 30 weeks. It is like such a deep philosophical argument that like people have been batting this back and forth for 2,000 years. It is wild how much depth there is to this. And Paul is pressing into the depth of that and is making this argument. He kind of looks like he's going back and forth a little bit, but what he's doing is he's actually building an argument and he's refuting people who are coming against the gospel. So he starts this out in the first 3 chapters. He talks about how salvation can only come from Jesus. It doesn't come from anywhere else. He talks about how God gives us free will to sin. And even if we want to do terrible things, like he lets us because he gives us that free will, even if it hurts us. He talks about how we can't judge people because only God does, because he is perfection. He is the thing we're looking at. He talks about how even when we're unfaithful, God is still faithful to us, even though we don't deserve it. And he talks about how true righteousness comes from God. And essentially, he's taking this first few chapters to hammer in the truth for mostly the Jews at this point of what this is supposed to look like and how we don't get trapped in legalism. Okay? So, let's look at the legalism and license thing again. So, most of today, we're talking about legalism, and I'll kind of intro the license and pass that off, but Caleb's going to be talking about that in 2 weeks, and we'll bring this back up and kind of show where we land on some stuff. And then next week, Cody's taking a rabbit trail because Cody. And he's hitting on chapter 5 and talking about some other parts of this. But the question here that Paul is putting forward is, he's saying, you guys are being legalistic. How do you get to the middle? That's the whole question, is how do you get to where you have a healthy and righteous view of the gospel? So he starts out with the story of Abraham. So kids, you guys know who Abraham is? No? I know you do. I've heard you talk about him before. How many sons does Father Abraham have? Many. All right, Romans 4, verses 1 through 3, he starts quoting Abraham. It says, what then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, so if salvation came through the work or the law, or legalism, then he had something to boast about, but not before God. Because Abraham didn't boast before God in this whole situation. He gets into that. Verse 3, what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So, Paul here is quoting Genesis 15, okay? He's talking about the story of Abraham and what Abraham did. And essentially, God looks at Abraham, and he comes to him and he says this. He says, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Okay? So, kids, imagine God comes to you and says, I am your shield. I protect you. And I'm your reward. I've got good stuff for you. So Abraham looks at God and says, what on earth could you possibly give me? You know, he's like, seriously, what could you give me that I don't have? Because everything I have I want, but the one thing I really want, I don't have. And I just want kids. And he's like, I don't have an heir. I don't have anyone to follow my lineage. Because back in the day, if you didn't have somebody to take your family on, then everything you believed and everything you were just stops with you. So he's like, I don't have a kid, what am I going to do? And God looks at him and he says, not only am I going to give you a kid, look up at the stars. So Abraham looks up at the stars and he says, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. Like, not only are you going to have one, an entire people group is going to come from you. And here's what he says in response to that. Genesis 15:6. All right, kids, I'm going to ask you a question, so listen carefully to this verse, okay? Austin, you want to listen? I'm going to ask you a question, okay? All right. Genesis 15:6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. So why did God move in Abraham's life? I'll read it again. Ready? Abram believed the Lord. So why did he do it? Because Abraham believed him. It's because he had faith. So Abraham looked at God, and when God said an absolutely crazy thing, Abraham goes, okay. Like, think about that for a second. Like, adults, think about that. I think this needs to be one of those, like, childlike faith things. If you're looking at God in the face and he says, this is what I'm going to do, how often do you say, okay? And how often do you say, there's no way? You know, like, I don't think you're going to pull that. Me? No, you're looking in the wrong direction. And God, looking at Abraham, says, I'm going to do this thing in you. Just watch. And Abraham responds by saying, okay, that's exactly what it's going to be. So let's pull up the little chart thing here again. The thing that the whole argument that Paul is making here is that to get away from legalism, the thing that you have to have is faith. Faith is the thing that gets you down to the middle of it. Get the next slide on there, Abby. So the thing that gets you from legalism to a healthy view of what the gospel is faith. So this whole argument he's about to make here, this whole chapter, the next two chapters really, is all an argument of if you have faith that God is actually who he says he is, then he's going to move in this and you won't be legalistic. You're not going to be stuck on the law because faith is what puts our whole mind in God and gets us to actually trust him. It's the idea of when God says it, it's actually going to happen and I believe it. It's that God is who he says he is. It's that God actually cares for you and that Jesus and Jesus alone saves you. Okay? So then he goes into the next little bit of this, and in verses 4 and 5, he gives us really an analogy of what this looks like. And he says, if somebody works, they get paid. But if somebody doesn't work and trust God and then they still get paid, it's not payment, it's a gift. So faith is what gives us a gift. And then in verses 7 and 8, he talks about David, and he actually quotes David saying that we're blessed when God doesn't count our sin against us. When we have faith in Jesus, God doesn't actually count that against us. He doesn't count our sin against us, and he gives us something that we don't deserve. That's through faith. So then he gets kind of to the meat of the argument and goes on in verses 9 through 13. So everyone pull out your apps or your Bibles or whatever. We'll look on the screen here. Verse 9. This is his real big argument, okay? Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We've been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. So essentially he's saying, he's asking the question, is it before the law, before he was circumcised, or after the law, after he was circumcised? And kids, if you don't know what circumcision is, ask your parents. You're going to have a fun lunch. Verse 10, he says, under what circumstances was it credited? So was his faith credited to him before he was circumcised or after he was circumcised? And he says it was not after, but before. So this sounds like a whole lot of back and forth. I know how much we talk about circumcision in the church today. It's a thing that, every day you walk in, that's part of the conversation. It's not. I hope not. Gosh, I guess I'm not in every life group, but yeah. So, no, okay. So essentially, he's pointing out something that is super important for these people, okay? That people would have really been thinking about is was it before the law or after the law? And the argument he's making is, guys, the faith that he was credited with happened before the law even existed. So it's not doing all the right things that got him to be called righteous. He was called righteous and then given the law so he knew what to do. There's a huge difference in that. And he continues on here in verse 11 and explains that. He received circumcision as a sign, as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised but him who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. And here's the key part right here, verse 13. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be an heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. Again, super easy and straightforward verse, right? Everyone knows what this means. I'm just kidding. Okay, so what he's saying, the argument he's making to a super philosophical crowd that loves being challenged with their thought. He says, the faith came before the circumcision. It came before the law. And because he had faith in God, God had the mercy to give him the law. But essentially, he was already saved before that because of his faith, because of his righteousness. Now we have Jesus who saves everybody. And the reason that even Abraham could be saved was because Jesus came later. Because of the righteousness of what Jesus did. It's a super deep concept. And as he's working through this, he's saying, so Abraham is not only the father of the Jews who had the law, but he's also essentially the father of the ones who weren't circumcised, the Gentiles, who are going to come way, way later, because he showed what actual righteousness looked like because he had faith in God. And ultimately, salvation comes through faith in God. Okay? So the argument for us is like, okay, cool, that's what salvation means. But for the people listening who were totally wrapped up in the law and totally wrapped up in the reality of the Jewish group and like what they were standing for, these people just had their entire world turned upside down. Because he's saying the law is great, but it comes after salvation. It comes after faith. So faith is the thing we need to be looking towards. Like faith is the thing that we need to stand on. So for us, let's put the faith thing back up there again. For us, I seriously doubt that anyone here is super distraught over eating shellfish and hooked animals. You know, I don't think anyone's looking at the law and is like, oh my gosh, I just can't live up to this. Like you just kind of read through it and you're like, yeah, that was them, not us. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're different than me. But this might be a little sacrilegious. I'll say it. Sacrilegious might not be the right word, but it feels a little wrong. But the crazy laws that are you can't walk down the street with an ice cream cone in your pocket on a Thursday. Have you guys ever heard some of those crazy laws? Being 2,000 years removed from the law, a lot of the Old Testament law feels like that to me. Where I'm like, this is wild. Why did God, of all the things he could pick, he's like, really hate pigs. They're the worst. Stay away from everything having to do with pigs. And God knew bacon. It just blows my mind. But he cared enough about the people to teach them about things they didn't even know yet. Literally, people didn't even know about bacteria back then. And they didn't realize that pigs were eating their own poop and that you could get sick from that. But God was just protecting them. So following the law was having faith in God that he knew what he was talking about. And that I was going to do it anyway because he knows best. So for us, that is more of what the legalism can look like. Is that we are so obsessed with doing everything perfectly, we forget about the fact that God is on the throne. And that God is perfect. And that he is the one doing those things. So, again, like I said, in a couple weeks we'll talk about legalism or about license, which is probably more of our issue than the legalism. But I think a lot of us have an issue with the legalism. And it's looking at yourself and saying, I am worthless because I am not perfect. I think that's kind of the core of what legalism often looks like. So, again, kids, I got a question for you. This is a harder one, okay? Ben, you listening? We got some kids. Jedediah, looking at you. Okay, so my question is, are there ever things that you do that make you think my parents won't love me anymore if I do that? No? Sometimes you do things where you just feel really horrible about the thing. And you feel like no matter what, that person can't love me because I'm so bad about what I did. And I think that is the core of where the legalism feeling comes from. Is there are times where we do things where we think there's no way that God could possibly love me if I've done this thing. So adults, let me ask you the exact same question because I think it's the exact same for us. Are there things that you do that when you do them, you think there's no way God still loves me after this? Are there things that you do when you do them, you're like, I am a worthless piece of trash. Why would God even walk with me anymore? Are there things that you do where you're like, why am I still in leadership? Why has he not pulled me out? Why am I still discipling this person? What are they going to get from me? I got nothing to offer. Are there things that you do or don't do that just make you feel like human garbage and you can't take another step forward? That's legalism. That's being so trapped in this feeling where you just feel like there is no way forward, and what's the point in even trying to walk with Jesus because I could never do it? That's legalism. That's being trapped in that place of needing perfection in your life, or needing to feel like you have to just absolutely knock it out of the park every single time. As I was preparing this, I was thinking through like different stories that I've had, things that I've lived through that show legalism, and there were just so many that like I couldn't really pick one because I think all of us honestly like put the bar too high sometimes in our lives. But one massive one in my life was when I lived in Texas. Up until 17, 18, I really was walking away from Jesus and wanted nothing to do with him. And then God, when I was 18-ish, really got a hold of my heart and just started changing everything. And I lived with 8 different guys in this house, and it was a crazy place. Like, it was this weird thing, but we called it a discipleship house. And the whole point of this was to live in this place where we all together were going after Jesus. And we had to wake up at 5:45 every morning, which for me was horrible. That was 4 or 5 hours before I would have woken up otherwise. Some of you guys are like, 4:45 is nothing, but 5:45 for me was insane. And we would spend 15 minutes doing like a devotional and doing worship together and just connecting with God together as a house. And then from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, we all went off in our own directions and we spent time with God, and we would get in scripture, we would worship, we would pray, and we spent a solid hour just with God. And for me, the first time I tried that, I maybe lasted like 6 minutes before I was completely out of things to pray for and read, and I was like, I don't know what else to worship, this is all I got. But over a couple of years, like, it got to the point where I was actually like really looking forward to time with Jesus, and I was really working into that, and I was excited to get into scripture, and it really changed me. But then I like half moved to England and then got married and moved back, and like all this stuff happened. And my first year of marriage to Autumn, I tried to do that same thing. I was like, this is what a godly person looks like. You wake up at 5:45 and you spend time together, praying or whatever, and then you spend an hour with God at least on your own, maybe 2 if you're really godly. Like, you've got to do this thing, And being newly married, you have somebody to hang out with until 1 a.m. watching TV, and you screw up your sleep schedule. And then they're a morning person and you're not, so everything's messed up. And like, there's all these things that are just different about marriage, right? And all of a sudden I was working a job where I had to be at work at 7:30. So how do you spend an hour with God? Well, you get up at 4 or whatever, Like, I kept pushing it forward and like trying to do this thing that I thought would make me more godly, because all the really godly people I knew did this. And for that first year, I was just absolutely incapable of doing it. Like, it just did not work. And I would spend 10 minutes and fall asleep, or I would only spend 15 and then I had to run out of the house, and I would try and read this thing, but I just didn't have it in me, and I would stop. And for that first year, like, I beat myself up every single day because I felt like a failure. I felt like there was no possible way I could follow Jesus like that. And then I would look at people that I looked up to. A guy named Jimmy, who's actually our speaker at Realign this year, spends 4 hours a day with Jesus in the morning, every morning. It's just like what he does. He's in scripture and praying for 4 hours a day. And I was like, well, that's how you become a godly person. I need to do that. And I set such an unhealthy high bar for myself in my life that I was completely incapable of actually living up to it, And I actually in that season started totally drifting away from God, to where I was just like, what's even the point? I can't do this. And in that season, I actually learned, for one, like, you don't have to spend an hour with God for your entire life to be a good Christian. And there's some people who spend 4 hours with God and they probably should be doing 5. And I realized, like, I wasn't wired that way. And it was a good thing to have the discipline of it for a year or 2 in the discipleship house, but I'm not wired that way. I'm just not. I'm not a sit down for multiple hours person. I'm a during the day get with God wherever I can, and God meets me in the moment. It's a really healthy thing for me, and I kind of figured that out over that first year. But I was so stuck in legalism that I couldn't figure out how to put faith in God and get to where he actually was. And I think that's the question for us today is like, are there things that you do or things that you don't do where you have such a high unhealthy bar on yourself that you're like, if I don't do this, God hates me. Or if I do this, then he's not going to want anything to do with me. Why would he show up tomorrow? And this spiritual gift is going to go away, and my time with him is going to be worthless, and I'm going to read and not even understand it. Like, there's all these things that go through our heads where we just put this crazy, unnecessary pressure on our own heads. That's legalism. And there's like two different kinds of sin in there that we often fall into. There's the sin of commission, like you're committing a sin, and the sin of omission, like I should be doing this and I'm not. And we definitely want to stay away from sin. I'm not at all saying that sin is a good thing, not even remotely. But we also need to trust that our faith in God is what gets us to him not doing everything right. Okay? Now, on the other side of the coin, you've got license, and I'm not going to go into this long because this is what Caleb's preaching about in a couple weeks, but let's put that back up there. License is abusing God's grace and choosing to keep on sinning no matter what's going on, and just kind of seeing what you can get away with just because you're saved, and you're like, I guess I have like a get out of hell free card, you know? And we see all over the Bible how we reach God in that way. So James 2:17 says, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So he's like, you got to do something. You got to do the right thing. Or Paul puts it in Romans 6:18. He says, you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. So he very clearly puts it out. We'll go to the last slide here. License, like the thing that we use to combat license is righteousness. So there's this crazy balance, and that's what he's getting at over about 4 chapters here. Actually, really, I guess 8 chapters. Is we've got the legalism where we need to make sure that we're not putting crazy, unhealthy rules on ourselves and trying for perfection and beating ourselves up for not following the law, because we got to realize that faith in Jesus, faith in God is what redeems us. But on the other side of this, we can't just sin flippantly and be crazy about this and just not look like Jesus. There's this righteousness that takes us to the cross. And at that kind of middle ground of faith and righteousness is where we really see a healthy view of what the gospel is. So this is kind of the setup for the next 3 chapters that we're reading through here. But for today, I think my question to you guys, or my prompt for you guys, is just what weight are you putting on yourself, on your own shoulders, that you aren't supposed to have? What are the things that when they happen, you run away from God instead of running to God? What are the things that you do when you can't possibly look yourself in the mirror because of how wretched you are? And if that is a thing that's tripping you up, like you're living in legalism. And the heart is to be like Jesus, I know. The only reason you're even beating yourself up for that stuff is because you know what righteousness is. But we can swing so far away from that we are completely debilitated and we are completely stuck in our sin because we think we have to jump through all these hoops for God to love us and for people to accept us and for the church to come around us. And really, what Paul is pushing here is, guys, don't get so wrapped up in this that you miss Jesus. Don't get so wrapped up in all the right things to do that you forget why you're doing them. And that's so easy to do, especially if you're a new Christian. If you just gave your life to Jesus in the last few years, it is so easy to be on this upward trajectory of I'm getting better, God's doing this, and I like God's doing this, it's so great, and then you plummet, and you're like, well, it's over. I'm never going to get back up there. But in actuality, a walk with Jesus is a lot of ups and downs. Just life is a lot of ups and downs. And there's seasons where we just are not crushing it. And that's okay. Again, not an excuse for sin, but it's an invitation to find Jesus in the middle of that. And when we think that we have to hit that bar every single time, we miss Jesus. And ultimately, that's what he doesn't want for us. That's what Paul doesn't want for us. That's what God doesn't want for us. He doesn't want us to miss Jesus in the midst of trying to look like Jesus. Because at that point, what's the point? We're doing works just for the case or for the sake of works. So, guys, when you came in, you got a card. Go ahead and pull it out. Kids, you guys got your binder thing, right? Your little clipboard. Can you pull it out? So grab your little clipboard. You've got a whole bunch of different things you can fill out on there, but you've got a connection card on the back just for you guys too. And adults have it on the card. You can also scan the thing on the back of the chair in front of you. The first thing is I feel like I'm leaning too far into legalism. So if that's you, you need to remember that it's your faith in Jesus that saved you. You can mark that top one. Kids, yours says, I think I have to do everything right, and I need to remember it's faith in Jesus that saved me. The second one is I feel like I'm leaning too far into license. Again, we're going into that in a couple weeks, but we go back and forth, so I put it in there. For kids, it's I have trouble doing the right thing, and I need to remember that Jesus calls me to righteousness. And the third thing here is this week I have faith in God to show up in blank. And I want to encourage you guys, the core of the argument that Paul's making here is not the law versus where you should be and all that stuff. The whole core, the end line that he wants to get you to is have faith that God actually is who he says he is. Have faith that God's actually going to show up in your life and you don't need to do it all for him. He shows up. So fill out that card, and as we worship here, you can put it in the box there. We've also got a little bit of prayer at the end, but let me pray for us and close us out in that, and we'll worship. So God, Lord, we just thank you that the unhealthy bars we set for ourselves are not the ones that you set for us. And then even this, as we look at it, is not an invitation from Paul to a happy-go-lucky, do whatever we want to do. We're not supposed to swing all the way over to the license to sin either. But it's an invitation to actually trust who you are, to have the faith to trust that you're a good God. And that you don't love us because we're sinless. You love us in spite of our sin, and because of that, you took care of us. Thank you, God, that we get to live in that place of not feeling the weight of that and not being completely crushed by it. Lord, I just thank you for the ways that you're working in us, and that you're never going to give up on us, even if we don't.